Welcome to a Mackenzie Institute Long Talk.
Baruch Fischhoff of Carnegie Mellon University is a pioneer of risk communication. In the 70s and 80s, that research purported to tell us how to get people's acquiescence, if not support, for some things that might be perceived as dangerous. Well, it's many, many years later, and I want to get an update from this pioneer on how we're doing in the terroristic age. Welcome.
Well, welcome. Thank you for having me.
Well, in the olden days, it was thought that with the right communication technique, getting the math right, as they say, we could either get, as I said, acquiescence or approval. Is that about what risk communication was?
Well, I think the way I would think of is risk. One could think of two forms of risk communication. One is persuasive, which is to try to get people to accept a particular worldview and act in particular ways. And the second is what might be thought of as non-persuasive communication. It's not unpersuasive, but trying to give people the information that they need in order to make their own autonomous decisions. And if we mix the two, then we sometimes undermine both of them. People think we're trying to spin things, manipulate them, when we're actually just trying to help them.
Well, it was certainly popular in the oil and chemical industry, and a lot of research from the Chemical Manufacturers Association in your country lent a credence to the idea of getting the math right. Can you summarize what are roughly the rules of good risk communication by any chance?
Yeah. So one would want to do three things. One is to analyze the decisions in terms that people are facing, and in order to identify the facts that are most important to them. Second, understand where they're coming from. That is, what do they know already? What's important to them? And then finally, design communications, and then that might bridge that gap so that they are better informed in the most important way, and then to test those communications. And you mess up if you don't do all three of them. That is, if you don't get the facts right, then at some point you're going to be found out. If you don't understand your audience, anybody in communications would tell you you're in trouble. And if you don't test what you're doing, then you're going to get in trouble, because we all exaggerate how well we understand one another.
It seems to me there are several contradictions in the literature on risk communication, and I don't mean your papers, but I mean the cumulative research of all the people who are interested in that topic. And one is that good communication can cause people to calm down and be accepting of certain risks. But the other is more communication can cause people to be fearful. Have I got that Goldilocks problem just about right?
I think so. A formulation that I like is that our goal is fewer but better conflicts. That is, let's not argue where we're on the same page, but we just don't understand we're potentially on the same page, but we don't understand one another. And in places where our interests diverge, then let's figure out exactly what the issues are, and maybe we can cut a deal, or maybe we, as in The Godfather, we need to go to the mattresses.
And then the other contradiction is that there didn't seem to be thin slices of the data on how older people or younger people, women, indigenous people, different demographics would perceive risk. It seemed to be a one-size-fit-all, or did I miss some research?
No, I think that's a fair characterization. And perhaps we would be going down the wrong path if we try to provide those characterizations of people in terms of their essential properties. That is, there are differences between men and women. There are differences in terms of ages, in terms of how people process information, what's important to them, what they learned in their school and in their personal experiences. But none of those things really, as we would say in the sciences, explains a lot of the variance in human behavior. We're all complicated. There's lots of things that affect us and motivate us. So the more science you know, the better guess you have at what might be an effective, appropriate communication. But you really need to test it. And And that by viewing people as just old or young or members of this group or the other, in a way, you're not affording them the respect of their individual circumstances, and that lack of respect will come through in your communication.
And yet, if you don't recognize, for example, that indigenous people have a special relationship with the land or the environment or 7 generations out, you're showing, in a way, equal disrespect.
Absolutely. So, as I said, the more you know about people and where they are situated, the better chance you have of beginning a conversation in a mutually respectful, appropriate way. But unless you actually talk to them, you don't really know what's on their minds or what's at stake in a particular situation. And that act of consulting with them, or at least consulting with people in their community who have credibility, is a speech act that demonstrates that you treat them seriously.
Now, then there's the contradiction of human behavior, which we all know exists, but the people driving to the skydiving lesson, who are risk-taking people who really enjoy that risk, would possibly be outraged at people who speed or smokers in a public place. In other words, people have contradictions in their ability to assume or even want to take risks versus refusing to take risks. Speak to that a bit, if you would.
So psychologists have tried for many years to characterize people in terms as risk takers, and in ways that would apply to all areas of their lives. And they've generally failed. It turns out that people who are risk takers in their avocations, their hobbies, their sports, may have very cautious investment portfolios, or if they're scientists, only publish the most secure papers. So we have, since across the areas of our lives, we have some sort of portfolio of risks, and looking for consistency across those areas, it just isn't there.
So we are not unidimensional people, and you've made that point well. Aren't we also rather confused about a risk analysis or risk-benefit analysis or quantifying risk? The old story of the people who buy lottery tickets and hope for winning are in less likelihood of winning that lottery than they are getting hit by lightning. So we need some kind of risk education, don't we?
Well, I made perhaps a useful distinction between ignorance and stupidity. And with stupidity being that you're incapable of understanding, and ignorance being that you just don't know what the facts are in a particular situation. And that may be because you haven't had the benefit of an education, you've been systematically misled, the facts are hidden to satisfy people who are trying to sell you or convince you of something. And I think one of the ways that communications go astray is we give it our best shot, and if people don't respond in a way that we consider to be appropriate, we assume that there's something wrong with them as receivers, rather than something wrong with our communication, that we haven't really addressed their concerns, or got some other set of motives, or they just really haven't understood us.
Well, that's kind of the arrogant deficit model, where if we could just get our superior knowledge into the brains of the average citizen, they would accept whatever it is we're doing at this plant or in this government. That's a bit arrogant as well, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. And I think one unfortunate part in the situation is that it's frustrating not to be understood, particularly when the stakes are high and you're actually trying to help people, and it can be tempting to blame the audience. And sometimes there are consultants and pundits who will get work by flattering their clients by telling them, yeah, those people, they're really idiots, they're chemophobic or irrational about nuclear power, don't understand the value of this or that. And I think they do their clients a disservice when they don't do that. And And I guess the magic elixir is talking to people, testing your messages, and finding out what's going wrong.
Well, let's bring this up to date and into the terroristic age, and let's start by your relatively famous 1987 article, which made an analogy with the medical profession. Now, the Mackenzie Institute is interested in public security and safety, and part of that involves communication. And in the terroristic age, it's the old, if you see something, say something, except we're not told what to look for or who to tell. That's kind of frustrating. But you point out, I think, interestingly, that if risk communication were a medical product, it would have to go through trials and maybe double-blind tests to see whether you're doing people any harm, because people's immune system changes if you scare them. Talk about that for a bit.
Well, obviously I wrote it, but I still like that analogy that, that with pharmaceuticals, the communication is part of the product that helps people decide whether they want to take those risks in return for those possible benefits. It tells them how to use it, how to spot when things might be going wrong, and they want to consult with their physicians. And dealing with terror has just those properties. There are authorities who want to help us, and if they don't have the due diligence of telling us, of testing that we understand their messages, that they give us actual instructions, then they're not fulfilling their duty. In some sense, we're fortunate in medicine that there's some standard for testing. In the United States, we've just revised the common rule for informed consent for participation in medical clinical trials that now emphasizes having conformed consent forms can go 20 pages, and they're now required to have a short box at the beginning that tells you the things that are more important, without hiding from you all the other things that you might want to know, or the lawyers want to make certain has been put in front of you. And that discipline just isn't part of the terror-related community. And sometimes it's just psychology, that people exaggerate how well they understand other people and other people understand them. Sometimes it's tied up in politics. So as you probably know, after 9/11, there was strong political pressure to do something. We put together this color-coded scheme, and it took 10 years and several commissions, and the comments of many comments by late night comedians to finally get that withdrawn, because it achieved some sort of political status. I think people also don't realize how inexpensive it is to test, and what the benefits are to an organization the expected return on investment are to an organization of testing, in terms of just doing your job, not being caught flat-footed, not being held in front of an inquiry because people have misunderstood your message or have not responded appropriately in a way that would be to their best.
Now, I didn't ask your permission, but maybe I should now, post facto. I used to use your medical analogy and say, we think nothing of rounding up everybody in a high school gym when there has been some sort of incident, release, spill, and giving them a big dose of risk communication, comparing this risk with other risks, trying to make it voluntary, trying to make it known, etc. However, if we were to give each person a dose of a particular, even over-the-counter drug, that would surely be considered malpractice and even life-threatening. Was that a good extrapolation from your medical analogy?
Yeah, I think so. Particularly given how cheap it is to do even rudimentary testing. We have our Food and Drug Administration has a statutory risk communication advisory committee that I had the opportunity to chair for its first few years. We put together a guidebook. It's called Evidence-Based Communication of Risks and Benefits. You can download it for free if anybody's interested. And we ended every chapter with a short section saying how you could test messages on that particular topic for no money at all, so that there's no excuse not to test, for a little bit of money, and for money commensurate with the public health, political, economic states providing on good communication. And the no money at all communication is just have somebody think aloud as they read a draft of your communication, telling you whatever came into their minds and what things were unclear to them, saying you're not testing them, you're testing the communications. You're always, however long you've been doing this, you're always surprised by what people say.
Well, you've recommended a highly unusual, but I think effective methodology, and that is think about what you've written or are about to say. I've read a lot of emergency plans, and they say, don't forget, after a heavy rainstorm and flooding, make sure your water's potable. No indication whatsoever about how to do that. Or go to high ground. No indication of where that is, and people are notoriously challenged by judging distances and height and what have you. So aren't we in danger of just plain ordinary muddled or vague communication?
Yes.
Now, would you be surprised if I told you that in 100 of the world's top urban emergency plans, there are two words that are never used, and they are risk communication? Why would your hard-won research and your colleagues' research from the past 40 or 50 years be ignored in urban emergency plans?
I have to say it's a great source of frustration, and I think some of it is attributed to psychology. There's a well-known, there's a large literature on what's called the common knowledge effect, which is one of the corollaries of the general tendency to exaggerate how well we understand one another. The common knowledge effect is that where you assume that everybody knows what, say, potable means, or where high ground is, and if you make that assumption because it's common knowledge to you, then you'll fail to tell people that. And because you assume that people understand you, you don't bother asking them. There are sometimes institutional constraints. There's sometimes people don't want to. There are organizations that don't want to collect evidence on how good their communications are because they'll show them to be imperfect, and the lawyers tell them that you don't want to collect that evidence. There are sometimes consultants who sort of know what the public wants and needs, and can do that without evidence, and they would have to share some of those communication resources with people who can do this, can do the testing.
Well, I was surprised that you and your colleagues weren't at least reflected in the plans, if not cited and credited. The closest urban emergency plans come to showing cognizance of this area is that you never get 100% evacuation, even if you announce people will die if they don't leave immediately. You get people returning to evacuation zones for their pets or their livestock, or just to retrieve their belongings. You get quite risky behavior from people. And there is at least occasional reference to how difficult communication is in this regard. Try to have 3 people recommend an evacuation: the police chief, the Red Cross, the fire department, and so on. But that's as close as it comes, and it seems both a shame and life-threatening. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's sad and tragic. I think one kind of institutional constraint on that would be there are people who are constrained. They don't have the resources to move. They're really concerned about a child in daycare, or an elderly relative in a nursing home. And if you took the trouble to ask them about those circumstances, you as the emergency planner might have to allocate resources that you don't have in order to help them. So for institutional reasons, you may decide that you're better off not knowing.
And in
Excuse
long
me,
past,
hard to explain, hard to excuse.
sorry, repeat that again. I interrupted you.
Oh, I was just saying that's the kind of explanation that's something that one can explain but not excuse.
Well, and then we move into the electronic age past the time when your research was done, and we have notifications that the power is out on devices that need power in order to receive the message that the power is out. That's ironic at least. It is sketch comedy at worst. And yet some emergency plans in England recommend old-fashioned doorknob hangers, signs on lawns, knocking door to door, loudspeakers, and old-fashioned technology, not relying on electronics. Have you encountered this, and what's your reaction to notifying people their power's out on a device that needs power?
Well, somebody hasn't done a very good systems analysis, and then you could wonder, there are teams, the risks are very complicated, particularly ones like these that are situated in people's lives, where there may be collective behavior, where everybody's trying to evacuate at the same time, where people aren't assured that their loved ones are being taken care of. So it takes to get it right, you do need the risk communicators who can test your messages, but you also need the social workers and educators who can help you understand these complicated, the complex lives that we all live. And if there's not a telecommunications person at the table, then you may well miss something seemingly as obvious as that.
Now, a couple of thoughts that you may be able to connect. One is, if one reads the history of terrorism and urban violence and disorder, I think you'd have to come to the conclusion that we are not in a more dangerous era now. You will remember hijackings of planes and bombings in both America and in the UK in the 60s and 70s, and we don't seem to have as much violence today, but we are more worried about it because of this see something, say something in the terroristic age. Your medical analogy pertains today. Are we harming people by scaring them?
Well, I would go. So one of the things that we find when we study risk is that there are different ways of defining risk. So one could look at risk just in terms of the annual fatalities from a particular cause, and say that the world is safer now. That you could look at those kinds of statistics. I think back to, I remember my nightmares during I remember one nightmare during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you could say, well, nothing happened during we didn't have after the bombs in Japan, we didn't have another thermonuclear strike during that, but the risks were very large. And in some sense, for my generation, where we had civil defense drills in school, they were an ever-present danger that weren't captured in the annual statistics. So you could say, driving, I'm at no risk of driving, sitting here talking to you from a second floor office. Nobody's going to plow into me, and so on. On the other hand, just as I was always at risk of, in the Cold War, I would have been at risk of a thermonuclear war. Right now, small, very low probability, very high consequence event. Some of these some terrorist events could happen at any time, and you can't put them out of your mind. So they take a toll. School children in this country have active shooter drills, and could you realistically tell them to put those out of their mind? You could realistically ensure that those drills gave them accurate information, so you make certain that there's benefit from the cost that they're incurring. So I would caution against reducing risk to any single measure.
I would like your quick view of some of your colleagues. I've also been inspired by the work of Roger Kasperson, who talks about risk magnification, the social amplification of risk, where I think you would agree what people say about risk, what people do about risk, the signage, public communication will affect people's risk perception. And do you agree?
Yes. Yeah. So we're not, nobody is an expert in everything, in all of the, in all of the risks in life. We turn to other people, and if we have an expert in our family, have an uncle or an aunt who's an expert, or niece who's an expert in this, then then we have it. But we also look to what other people are doing, inferring, perhaps wrong, that somehow they're in touch with people who actually know. I think the best that experts can do is to be proactive in the communication. So there's a tendency among technical experts to want to get all the facts right before saying anything, and sometimes before they do that, a risk has taken on a life of its own. So an expert will often be able to bound what the risk is, to give appropriate assurances to what's being done about it. But if they don't step in, then something will go viral.
Well, now you're the expert, so let me test one of the pieces of advice that I give that builds on what you just said. We may never know the cause of TWA 800's crash, or Egypt Air 990, or the aircraft in the Pacific. Many events remain mysteries. And I counsel people to get comfortable with the gradual and sequential release of what information they do know when they know it, because if you wait for perfect knowledge, you may never communicate and do people harm with that communication vacuum. Do you agree with that strategy?
I think that that's really excellent evidence, because you as an expert can bound the risk in a way that a non-expert can't. You already know way more than they do. And that by your being proactive, you're also establishing the trust that you're somebody who's leveling with them, because in the end, we rely on people to manage our risk. We rely on, when we're small, we rely on our parents to manage our risks, and we hope that they'll, and just now, or whether it's airplanes or terror, it's those people who establish themselves as being willing to level with us, treat us as adults when we're adults, and respect us and share what they have. And you can get the market share you have a better chance of getting the market share as the respected source if you're proactive.
And isn't, as a general rule, silence more scary than facts?
Yes, particularly, yes. Trying to think of a counterexample. That's what we do as scientists, but I would say as good advice, general advice sounds pretty good.
Now, in the olden days, you had to have a second language skill to get a master's degree, and you have more than a master's degree. I don't know whether you read Ulrich Beck in German. I certainly can't, and he is translated very poorly. But his thesis is captured in the concept of risk society. And I think I reflect that reasonably well by saying, in medieval times, if I worked on a cathedral, I would know that I could hit my thumb with a hammer or get a stone chip in my eye or maybe fall off the scaffolding. And I could do my own risk-benefit analysis and decide, yes, I want to work on that cathedral. And so could the townspeople say, these workers are kind of rowdy, but we do want a cathedral. In the nuclear, terroristic, and chemical age, Beck says risk is spread all over the world, democratically affecting rich and poor alike, and there is no safe place. And the risk also travels through time. His analogy is the dead of Chernobyl and the dead of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have not all been born yet. It is going to be future generations that suffer from those events. Are you familiar with his work? And I bet you are. And what's your comment?
Well, I think that's a good characterization of the pervasiveness of risk and the complexity, the different associations that people will make. And I think his work was persuasive in getting people to accept that reality, and then to give people give responsibility to people in your role and mine, a mission to make this world as comprehensible as possible to people, and give them the feeling that there are people who are trying to help them to make the best decisions that they that they can. And if we, if there's nobody fulfilling that role, then people are, realistically feel vulnerable. At the time we're doing this, we're talking this right after the Max 8 crashes, and while those investigations are going on, the credibility of our federal aviation administration is coming into question, and it's coming into question regarding these particular crashes. But it's turning out that they have been under-resourced or they haven't had the resources for independently validating aircraft and procedures, and they will be a challenge for them and those who provide them resources to win back that credibility that will diffuse through other aircraft, and then people will wonder, well, what about these other regulatory bodies that we've been trusting and have perhaps been outsourcing some of their work.
Now, I think it's fair to say that your work has affected many a public meeting, because the company spokespeople and the consultants that you recommend have taken your work and applied it to this particular situation that they're going to go into. The Mackenzie Institute followers and members are very interested in public safety and order and the communication that can result. So what is your final commentary, perhaps? This is what we call a long talk. It isn't, a radio newscast that has to end in 30 seconds. So what is your final commentary and on reflecting on the 50 years of research you've done on this topic and where we're at with it?
Yeah. So I would say I think we know how to do better than we're doing. And I'm sort of grateful for all of the practitioners like yourself who are trying to apply what we do. And if it doesn't work, I'd be grateful if you gave us a hard time, because that'll give us more research to do and show the limits to our inevitably imperfect science. And I think the discipline is, get the facts right, find out, that are relevant to people's decisions, not the facts that the experts might like to share. So get the facts, the relevant facts right, find out where people are coming from, which requires two-way communication with them, and then test your messages in a way that establishes your credibility, and stay in touch with the people that you're asking to trust with you. In order to do that, you need a pretty big team. You need people who are subject matter experts. You need people who are decision-making experts who can take that fire hose of facts and winnow it down to the things that matter. You need behavioral scientists who can think about why it is that what might be difficult to understand and how people might do it. And then you need communication professionals who will create those relationships, will make certain that the mics are there, will check that everything is legal, be aware of sensitivities that a scientist couldn't possibly know.
Well, I can tell you, I bet many people watching wish they had professors who were as plain speaking and as enthused about what they're doing 50 years on as you sure appear to be. So thanks very much for your time.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. Nice to meet you.
Any views expressed here are not necessarily those of the Mackenzie Institute, its speakers, sponsors, or supporters. But the Institute is dedicated to fostering public discussion, debate, and education about security matters. Google the Mackenzie Institute to join the discussion. The Mackenzie Institute is grateful to its sponsors and supporters. Some of our short pods and long talks are a result of the support of Heathbridge Capital Management Limited, the National Post, and Dundurn Publishing.